LCC International University, as you can see on the slide, is the only North American style university in the heart of Europe, which is Lithuania. And Lithuania is one of the Baltic countries situated on the Baltic coast, surrounded by countries such as Latvia, Poland, Belarus, and others. And we're situated in the port city of Klaipėda, which is rich with many sites, and we have a beach and a forest and an old town, and there are many places where students can go and hang out, as you can see on the pictures. And it's a very nice location. It's not a big city comparing to some of the giant cities, and it's very nice atmosphere here. Here's our LCC campus from the bird view and from the down-the-earth view, and you can see that here you can see that we have 2 dorms, also the gym and the sports center, and our campus with the classrooms. So everything is kind of together, and you have access to all the facilities by a 2 or 3 minute walk. What is special about LCC and what is our educational model? As I mentioned before, LCC is a North American style university, and you will really experience this tonight as Joe is coming from the States, and he will be speaking and teaching in English. And that's how it really feels in LCC classroom, where a lot of our professors and staff are coming from the US and Canada. We also have local professors, but it's just about this North American style, the language, and just the way of the teaching. Liberal arts aspect of LCC is your opportunity to get your major of choice, and we'll talk about the majors at LCC a little bit later. But also with that, you have opportunity to take elective courses from other majors, and upon graduation, you have this well-rounded understanding of different degrees and different spheres. LCC is a very international place, not in its name, but also in its nature. We have students coming from more than 50 different countries, and it's a very exciting opportunity to live and study with people all around the globe. Also, LCC is a Christian university, and we express this in our values and morals, as well as some classes that students have to take as a part of their curriculum. And it just creates a very safe space to learn and communicate for students. LCC is fully accredited in European Union and all around the world, and its diploma recognized worldwide, so you have no problems of getting a job in European Union or getting a master's degree in the US, and a lot of our graduates do so. And LCC is a very relational place. We have a very tight community, and the ratio between the professors and students is not as high, so you have a very good chance to develop those close relationships with professors at LCC. And what are the majors at LCC? We have 6 majors. The duration of every major is 4 years, and it's international business administration. You have a chance to learn about finances, marketing, management, and so you also have contemporary communication major, which is pretty wide and includes many things in it, from PR to video production to photography, visual design. Also, there's English language and literature. Also includes in its name the English major, English language interpretation and teaching. International relations and development gives you opportunity to study about politics and history of different countries and how they connect and relate to each other. Psychology degree is also pretty broad and vigorous major that helps you to understand the human nature and how your mental state works with your physical state, and also the theology major that helps you to dive into the biblical understanding and how it connects with the life today. Okay. And we also have 2 MA programs, one in international management and another in TESOL, teaching English as second language. And I think at this point, I'll just give the word to Joe, and you can share your slides, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Albina. And we're going to do a quick switch here. And I'm going to share this screen and move some things around here briefly. But Albina, thank you for that introduction. and the other information. And I should tell the rest of you that Albina is one of my favorite people at LCC, and I'm glad that she's now doing this role here too, and connecting with people like you. So, but I'm glad to be with you this evening. At least it's early evening here in Klaipėda. I don't know where you are, of course, but I'm so glad that you have chosen to join us. And as we talk about how we might think theologically, and I'll explain that term in a minute, how we might think theologically about film, in particular, Lord of the Rings. But I wanted to quickly just introduce myself just a little bit more. I won't take long here. But I am here in Klaipėda teaching at LCC with my family, and we have 3 kids. And when I describe where I'm from in the United States, I sometimes explain to people, well, there are parts of the US that tourists visit when they go there. Places like Washington, D.C. or Hollywood or Disneyland or New York City. And then I say, I am not from any of those places. So those places are all on the coasts of the United States. And I come from a place in the middle, the state of Nebraska. And as I sometimes explain to students in Nebraska, there actually are more cattle than there are people. By the way, this is not me. This is just some cowboy picture that I pulled off the internet. But I wanted to. I'll show you here quickly. My son Caleb is here in the room with me, and I asked him to come in here because it's actually Caleb who is he's the true Tolkien expert. So you can see there on that stool about how many books do you have there by Tolkien? There's maybe close to 20 different books written by J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the author of The Lord of the Rings. And these are my copies of the Lord of the Rings books that the films are based on. And I'll refer to them in a minute here too. So I wanted to start, or I wanted to, again, to say a few things about The Lord of the Rings and about how we might use some tools to think about films, but I actually wanted to start with a quick clip, a little short bit from another film called The Truman Show. This is now a quite old film from 1998, but maybe some of you have seen it. And I should explain, by the way, I should give a spoiler alert because I'm going to say some things that will give away the plot. So if you've never seen this film and you want to, well, you should shut me up and you should mute me so that you won't hear. But I'll explain just a little bit. The premise of this film, The Truman Show, is that Truman has spent his entire life on an enormous film studio, and he doesn't know it. It's actually his entire life from birth and now to adulthood has been broadcast to a worldwide television audience, and millions of people have been watching him his entire life. Everyone in his life is an actor, including the people that Truman believes are his parents. So essentially, Truman has been the star of the most famous TV show in the world, and he doesn't know it. There's even technology to simulate the weather. Even the sun is artificial. It's just a gigantic light that rises inside this huge dome in which Truman lives. But for Truman, all of this is reality. This is what he knows. This is all he knows. And in the film, as the film begins, Truman is beginning to wonder about some things. And so I'm going to play you just a quick clip from the beginning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Yeah. Morning, Truman.
Morning, Spencer. Hey, Pluto. Oh, no. Get down.
He won't hurt you.
Get down. Yeah, I know. It's just me.
Come on, Pluto.
Here's a news flash just then. An aircraft in trouble began shedding parts as it flew over Sea Haven just a few moments ago.
Oh.
Wow, luckily no one was hurt. But hey, how do you feel today?
Okay, that's all that I'll show of that. Now, to us, as the viewers of that movie, watching, seeing that light falling from the sky, we know what it is. It's part of this enormous television studio that's accidentally fallen from this distant ceiling. But Truman doesn't know that. To Truman, this is a completely mysterious event, and the radio announcer, who's of course not really a radio announcer, he supplies an explanation and says, well, it's some airplane parts. But as the movie progresses, Truman's entire understanding of what is real begins to change. By the way, some of you might be familiar with the Greek philosopher Plato, and you might know of Plato's allegory of the cave from Plato's book, The Republic. And you might see some allegories, see some parallels between this film and Plato's allegory, where Truman comes to experience a new reality. But the primary theme of the Truman Show is what we might call a change in Truman's worldview. At the beginning of the film, Truman has certain basic assumptions about life. He just knows some things. He knows that his whole life he has been making free choices. He knows that his five senses are giving him a true picture of reality. He just knows that he is an ordinary person in an ordinary town. But at the end of the film, all that Truman knows has radically changed. Now, my point here is not to discuss Truman's change in worldview or even to discuss that movie in any depth, although the movie is interesting. But I just want to make the point that all of us have a worldview. And we might ask, well, okay, what is it? What is a worldview? And I know this sounds probably fairly obvious to say, but a worldview essentially is a way of seeing the world. That sounds obvious. There's a Christian theologian, and I've used the word theology in the title of this talk also. But theology is essentially the study of what Christians believe. And this theologian, Cornelius Van Til, used the illustration. He said, worldviews are like colored lenses. They're like colored glasses through which we view the world. Mostly, by the way, I wanted to show you this picture of a cute rabbit wearing glasses. That's why I'm using this. But a worldview, we look through our worldview glasses, and they shape then how we understand reality. It's through our worldviews that we experience reality. And we could think of some different types of worldviews. There'd be two basic types of worldviews that are very different, would be any form of theism on the one hand and materialism on the other. So theism is the belief that there is some kind of God or gods, plural. So polytheism, which is the belief that there are many gods, that's a type of theism. So is any type of monotheism, the belief in one God, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Materialism, on the other hand, is the conviction that there's nothing except matter that exists. That there's nothing supernatural. There's nothing outside of the realm that we can access with our five senses. And so let's imagine for a moment that there are two friends. One is a theist, we'll call him Theo, and the other is Molly, who is a materialist. And because of their differing worldviews, they're going to have different views on a lot of different things, for instance, regarding how they see death. Theist Theo might see death as a doorway to another world, to another plane, another type of existence. Molly, materialist, will see death just as the end of existence. They'll have different views on morality, on a moral code, and on ethics. Depending on what type of theist he is, theist Theo might see a moral code as something that is given by God, and that is the same for all people. materialist Molly will probably see morality and a moral code as something that you choose, or something that different cultures or even different individuals can invent or change. They might have different views regarding beauty. Theo might see beauty as the reflection of the glory of a creator God, especially if he's a Christian theist. Molly will probably understand her appreciation of beauty just as an evolutionary accident, just as the result of chemical byproducts in her brain. So you get the idea, and they would have differing views on a whole host of other things. I'll read you a very long quote here, but bear with me. The philosopher James Sire says that a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. You probably know what the word orientation means. It means a direction, kind of where our heart, our inner being, where it aims, where it points. A fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story. That's interesting, especially as we think of how this might relate to films, which usually come to us in the form of stories. That can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions. There's a big word for Monday afternoon. Presuppositions are assumptions which may be true or partially true or entirely false, which we hold unconsciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundations on which we live and move and have our being. Now, again, I know that's a very long quote, and there's a lot there that we could sort of try to unpack and talk about, but I just want us to understand that a worldview is a basic way of seeing reality. And I would suggest too that we don't always think about our worldview. Actually, usually we don't think about our worldview at all. Just like if you wear glasses, you don't go through your day thinking, oh, I'm wearing glasses. I'm looking at the world through glasses. I'm wearing glasses. I'm seeing things through my glasses. You don't usually think that. You don't really even pay attention to the fact that you're wearing glasses, unless they make your ears hurt or they get dirty and you can't see, or if somebody points at you and laughs and says, ha ha, your glasses are really old fashioned. But usually we don't think about our glasses. They're just there on our face. They're just part of and our worldviews too are just part of the furniture, just kind of part of the makeup of our minds. Now, I want to say one other thing about worldview, and I want to use a different metaphor, a different image. And I borrowed this one from a guy that I know. His name is Ted Turnow, and his book, Popologetics, Popular Culture in Christian Perspective. And Ted Turnow uses the metaphor of a tree. Again, this is a little bit more complex than the glasses metaphor. And Turnow suggests that our worldviews function like this, that the roots of the tree, down in here, the roots of the tree are our presuppositions. Again, what are presuppositions? It's a big word. Well, these are basic beliefs about reality. Does God exist? Does he not exist? Can we access reality with our five senses? Can we trust our senses? Is truth something that is true for you and for me, or only for me? Some of our basic assumptions. And Turnow suggests then that our presuppositions, like the roots of a tree, then they shape the trunk. They shape what he calls the world story. And the world story is the story that we tell ourselves to try to make sense of the world around us. You might think of questions like, where did we come from? How did we get here? And I don't mean like, where did you come from before you entered the room where you're sitting now? I mean, where did we come from as human beings? How did we get here? How did we arrive on this planet? Where are we now? What am I doing here? What's our purpose? Where are we going? What's our future like? And I know those are huge questions, but you can think briefly about how you might answer them. And you would essentially, in your answer to those questions, you would start to tell your world story. you would start to, as you gave the answers to these questions, you would answer these in a particular way, and how you told your world story would say a lot about your presuppositions. Finally, Turnhow says that that from our presuppositions, which give rise or contribute to our world story, then he says the rest of the tree, in his metaphor, the branches and the leaves, that's how we actually live. And that's how that has to do with our ethical stance, how we treat others, the sorts of things that we value, how we set goals. Basically, it has to do with our real lived behavior. Now, I know that's all a little bit abstract, but the point is, again, that a worldview is sort of how we see reality, and it has to do with our basic presuppositions, our basic beliefs about reality, and how we answer those kinds of big questions about the nature of life, the origin of life, and the origin of our own existence. Two quick observations regarding this tree before we leave this tree altogether. And the first observation is that we as human beings are complicated, and we are often contradictory. And what I mean by that is that we are not always consistent in how our presuppositions and our world story affect our behavior. Sometimes there's a breakdown, there's a break between what we say we believe and how we actually act. You can think, for instance, of Christians who say they believe in God, and they believe that God loves them. They believe that God has commanded them to live in certain ways, including commanded them to be honest, but they tell lies and are dishonest. So that's not consistent. There can be other types of inconsistency. I've known someone, for instance, who says that she's an atheist. She doesn't believe God exists, but she says she also believes in reincarnation, that after death, she'll come back in another form of being, another type of life. And that's not consistent either. An atheist stance, an atheist worldview is not consistent with belief in reincarnation. So sometimes we're not consistent. The second observation I would make about this tree metaphor is that it reminds us too that our worldviews are often changing and developing. Our worldviews don't always stay the same. You might say that the tree of our worldview is being affected by things like wind and rain, and by drought, and by sun. But there are things that shape our worldview. So sometimes our worldviews change. And you might even have had that experience in your own life of having a major change in the way that you think. Okay, by now, you're probably wondering, why did I sign up for this talk? Because I thought this was going to be something cool about the Lord of the Rings. And here this American guy is talking about this weird, abstract philosophy stuff. So what does any of this have to do with films? And that's a very good question. There are two reasons that I think the concept of worldview is useful as we also think about pop culture. And I have the word pop culture there on the screen, or the phrase. And I should say, by the way, that by pop culture, I just mean cultural works that are easily accessible and widespread. That sounds kind of abstract too, perhaps, but pop culture, cultural works, cultural things that many people have access to, that are prominent and common in our culture. Things like films, but also books or video games, graphic novels, etc. There are many different types of pop culture. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to think about pop culture and worldview together is that pop culture can shape our worldview. That pop culture is one of those influences. Again, if you think about the tree and think about a tree being shaped by the weather and by the sun and by the wind, that pop culture is one of those influences, or can be one of those influences on our worldview. You think about what happens after you watch a good movie, for instance, or maybe even more so when you watch a really disturbing movie. You keep thinking about it. It keeps the film lives in your head for a while. Or you listen to a catchy song, and then it keeps bouncing around in your brain for the next 2 days. This last Monday, just the day before yesterday, in the history class that I teach, I played the song Stressed Out by 21 Pilots. And it goes, wish we could turn back time to the good old days when my mama, how's it go? When my mama sang us to sleep, but now we're stressed out. And I played that, of course, because it's the middle of the semester and because people are stressed out. But that song has been stuck in my head ever since then. So my point here is that if we're going to put stuff in our heads, whether it's music or whether it's films or other type of pop culture, then we need to think about it. We should pay attention. There's another writer, Kevin Van Hooser, who says the quote on your screen. He says, instead of addressing our belief systems head on, that means directly, cultural works structure our daily practices and colonize our imaginations. You might know the word to colonize. It means to make a colony. When a people or a nation colonizes, they move to another part of the world and kind of take over part of that area and plant a settlement, start to live there. And so this writer, Van Hooser, is suggesting that cultural works, including pop culture, can colonize our imaginations. Some of you, I'm guessing, are familiar with this film, the film Ratatouille. And you know that this guy over here, Remy, is a rat who loves food. And he actually becomes a chef in the film. He just delights in food, and he's very selective about what he eats, and he pays attention to tastes and flavors, and he loves to blend them together and make amazing new recipes. Again, he becomes a chef. But Remy has a brother, Emile, and Emile just eats anything. He just eats rotten garbage, he eats old banana peels, like brown apple cores, and then he's eating whatever this is that he has in his paw. So my point is that we don't want to be just passive consumers of pop culture, that we should think about them. So that's one reason. The second reason is something that is a bit more interesting, I think, and that is that I would suggest that works of pop culture usually have a worldview themselves, or maybe even more than one, depending on different characters. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that works of pop culture are expressions of a worldview because they, of course, are the products of the human beings who make them. But the creators of pop culture, again, whether they be musicians or film directors, often can use works of pop culture as expressions of a worldview. And one way to think about a cultural work like a film is to think about its worldview. Again, because we want to be thoughtful about the things that we put in our heads. If we're going to open ourselves up to the influence of say, a film, then we want to do so thoughtfully. Okay, so what does any of that mean? How do we investigate the worldview of a work of pop culture? Well, we ask questions. That's always a good beginning, right? And let me suggest some questions. I'm borrowing these from that same book, or some of them anyway, not all of them, by Ted Turnow. And he suggests that when we watch a film, there are some questions that we can ask, like this one. Here's a basic question. What's the story? That's a good place to start. We as human beings love stories. I think that's one of the first things little kids learn after they're born and they grow up, they learn they love stories. When my kids were little, they would climb onto my lap and they would say, read me a story. And then sometimes I even would make up stories to tell them. They love stories, and they still do. That's why they read. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that I love history, and I teach a history class here at LCC. I love stories, and history is a story, or many, many, many stories about the past. True story, at least if it's good history. We as human beings essentially live lives that are story shaped. Our lives have a beginning and a middle and the end, and there's conflict and there's colorful characters, and our lives, the plot line of our life story is some kind of crazy mix of comedy and tragedy, but we live lives that are shaped by story, as a story. If you ask somebody, how are you doing? How are you? Often the person will tell a story. Their story might go something like this. They'll say, oh, I've had the worst day ever. I slept through 6 alarms and I missed my first class. LCC students sometimes tell that kind of story. We're surrounded by stories, including stories in films. So the first thing that we need to do if we're going to think about the worldview of a film is to say, what's the story? We need to make sure we understand it. I taught a class here at LCC several years ago called Faith in Film, in which we watched a lot of films. And we would always start by making sure that we understood the plot. Sometimes members of the class would understand it a little bit differently. So basic questions, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what are the main characters and what's the conflict and what are the significant plot points and broad themes and what's the point of view and how is the story told? Question 2, where am I? Or to ask it a different way, what world am I in? As I'm watching this film or reading a book or listening to music, what world am I in? What world is being created for me? And then here we start to ask questions about how the creators of this film, for instance, are communicating the plot, because how the film is made or how the book is written, that makes a difference. That's why, by the way, there's a great deal of difference between reading the plot summary of a film on Wikipedia and actually watching the film yourself. Radically different experiences. Sure, you can learn what the plot is from reading Wikipedia or IMDb or some movie website, but you don't get all the meaning from reading the plot, because part of the meaning is communicated by how the story is told. So we ask questions like, how is it structured and what kind of choices did the director make? We might ask questions about pacing, how fast does the story move, and about lighting and camera angles, and about how time is treated. Is the story told chronologically or does it kind of jump around in time? But the structure of a film contributes to its meaning. I recently, actually it's a number of months ago, I watched the film 1917, the recent film about the First World War. Maybe some of you have seen it. But quite famously, the film is presented as one continuous shot. That is to say, the camera never leaves the main character. It just continuously follows the main character throughout the entire film. Just follows that character through crisis after crisis after crisis for 1 hour and 17 minutes. It's intense because of how the film is shot. And that's a huge part of what the film actually means. Because we get a sense, when we get done with that film, we get a sense of how both the war and time itself are just relentless. There's no break. You get a sense of the intensity of that experience. And actually, we experience time ourselves in life in a similar way. There's no break. You can't rewind. You don't cut away to something else. We just experience time in one continuous unrolling spool. So that's question 2. Question 3. What's under the surface? And now here is where we start to ask the kind of deep questions that get into the worldview of the film. We might ask questions like this. Well, what counts as good in this world? What counts as evil? What is beauty in this world? What is beautiful in this world, in the world of the film or of the book or of some other work of pop culture? How do characters change and develop? What makes life worth living in this world is another question that we might ask. Where is God in this world? Or is that just an irrelevant question? Or if there's not a God of some sort, is there a God equivalent? Is there a being of ultimate power in this cultural world, this pop culture world? We could ask, what is worshipped in this world? That is, what is placed as the character's number one priority? What is valued? And you see, when we start asking and attempting to answer these questions, then we're starting to dig below the surface. We're starting to get into the roots of the worldview tree, we might say, into the presuppositions. And there might be different worldviews in the same film, different characters with different worldviews. That's sometimes how conflict in a film works. And we should note also that the worldview of the film might not be the worldview of the creators of the film, but we can ask those kinds of questions and they help us begin to see, okay, what are the roots of this worldview? Question 4, last question, as we think about this this way of looking at films. And here we start to turn from the world of the film and we start to examine ourselves. And this, I think, is where things get interesting. Because once we have at least some sense of the worldview of the film, we can start asking questions of ourselves. Do I agree with this worldview or not? Do I think it's true? How different is it than my own worldview? If I disagree with it, why? If I agree with it, why? We might even ask, is there an aspect of my worldview that maybe I should rethink or change because of this film? It may not even be that you need to change your worldview on the deep level of presuppositions, but maybe up in the area of the branches and the leaves, in some area of lived behavior. Maybe there's a way that this film actually prompts you to change. Again, when I taught this class at LCC called Faith in Film, one of the films that we watched was a film called Children of Men from 2006, directed by Alfonso Cuarón. It's quite violent. I wouldn't recommend it for all ages, but it's a film of a dystopian future. The word dystopian means essentially a world that's gone bad. And in this dystopian future, no women has had any babies. No women have had babies for years and years and years. There are no babies being born, no young people. Essentially, in this film, humanity has no future. Humanity is going to go extinct. But in the film, there is a young woman who mysteriously gets pregnant. And then much of the film is about different groups that essentially go to war over this baby. And I can guarantee that if you watch this film, you'll never look at babies the same way again. Because in the film, this one baby is just extraordinarily precious. And it awakens you to the beauty and to the preciousness of every single infant life. So there are ways that films can start to affect and even change our worldview. But essentially, as you dig into the worldview of a film, you start to think about your own worldview. Okay, finally, since I said I was going to talk about Lord of the Rings, let me do so. And let me mention just really briefly the background of this cultural product. It is rooted in the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. He died in 1973. He was an English author, and he published these in 3 different volumes. Between 1954, I think 2 of them were published in 1954 and 1 of them in 1955. There have been a number of films that have been made based on these books. There's even been some cartoons, some animated features, but the famous ones, of course, are the ones by Peter Jackson that were released, the first in 2001, then 2003, or excuse me, 2002, and then 2003. And I should know because I saw each of them in the theater when it came out. So you had to wait for a whole year before you could see the next one. Now, question 1, and we're only going to just scratch the surface, as you might say. You can't talk about this in any sort of length, but the first question is, what's the story? And it's complex, to say the least. If you've seen the films or if you've read the books, I'm assuming that many of you have done one or the other, you know that this is a huge story. The films, by the way, themselves total over 9 hours long. My kids last week, on their break, they had a Lord of the Rings marathon, and they watched all 3 films, one after the other, and it took them all day long. If you watch the extended editions, it's like 11 hours. The books total in my editions are like over 1,000 pages. So this is a huge story, but we can summarize the story like this. Let me try to give a brief summary. I thought about, by the way, attempting to do this like, with the voice of Gollum and read. I'm not going to try to do Gollum for the entire summary. But the story begins actually thousands and thousands of years before the events of the Lord of the Rings. When an evil being named Sauron had created magic rings to give to elves, dwarves, and men of Middle-earth. And Middle-earth is the land mass, it's the continent on which this story takes place. And these magic rings gave the wearers, those who wore them, great power to do amazing things. But this evil being, Sauron, secretly created the One Ring, The one ring of power. It's a master ring that would control all of the others. And he used the power of the one ring to attempt to bring all of Middle-earth under his dominion. Again, I'm assuming that for most of you, I'm just telling you things you already know about the plot of this story. In a massive battle, again, thousands and thousands of years before the events of the Lord of the Rings, Sauron was defeated and he lost the one ring. And he lost some of his power, but he himself was not destroyed. And over the next millennia, the next thousands of years, he attempted to rebuild his power even without the one ring. Now, surprisingly, and this is the amazing thing in the story, surprisingly, the one ring was found. But not by a king, not by some great lord, not by a powerful person, but by a hobbit. And in the Lord of the Rings, and in this world that Tolkien has created, hobbits are one of the races of beings in Middle-earth, and they're fairly insignificant. They're short people, they're quite small, they don't rule large kingdoms, they're not very powerful. They like to garden, they like to smoke pipes, and they like to play games and lead comfortable lives above all. But one of these hobbits, Frodo Baggins, realizes that if Sauron regains the One Ring, then Sauron will have almost unlimited power. And the only way to prevent that from happening forever, to keep that from happening, is to destroy the One Ring. And the only way to do that is for Frodo to take the One Ring on an incredibly dangerous journey into the heart of Sauron's kingdom itself, and to throw the One Ring into a fiery mountain where it will be consumed. Okay, those of you who have read the film or read the books or watched the films know there's a lot more to the story than that. But question 2, where am I? What kind of world am I in when I enter the world that Tolkien and Peter Jackson has created? Well, the first thing to say is that it's a fantasy world. This is not the world as we know it today. It does have some parallels, I think, with the European medieval period, because it's a world without any industrial technology, more or less. Magic is real in this world, although not everyone can do it, just wizards. There are really terrifying monsters. There are goblins called orcs. There are huge spiders. There are flying creatures, the Nazgul, who are kind of like humongous bats or dragons. One of the amazing things about the films, and the book too, but Peter Jackson was brilliant, I think, at capturing this, is the scale. So the films are amazing at depicting both small, cozy hobbit dwellings and also these huge, sweeping battle scenes with tens of thousands of warriors. So we get a sense of the size of this story. It's also really long, as we know. We get a sense of how long this story has been continuing. Even before the events of the Lord of the Rings. And both the films and the books give you a sense of deep history. And what I mean by deep history is that we're aware that this is just a few years in a much, 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 much bigger story. Now, question 3, what's under the surface? Our third question. And again, there's a whole lot that we could say as we start to ask these kind of worldview questions. And I would suggest, by the way, that if there are additional themes that you think are important in the Lord of the Rings, you can put them in Slido or in the YouTube chat, and Albina will take note of them. So if there are other worldview themes that you think are in Lord of the Rings that I've missed, which I'm sure I have, I'm just going to mention 5. But one of these is that evil is real and that it is a derivative of the good. In other words, the world of the Lord of the Rings is not a world of moral relativism. And by moral relativism, what I mean is the idea that something can be right or wrong for me, but not right or wrong for you. And so someone who has the belief of moral relativism says, well, I choose my truth, I choose my moral code, you choose your moral code, what's true for you? Truth essentially and right and wrong is relative. It just depends on who you are. That's not true of the Lord of the Rings. Evil is very much evil for all people in the Lord of the Rings. There is not this kind of ambiguity. When I say that evil is derivative, what I mean is that Sauron himself cannot create. He can only corrupt. And in Tolkien's mythology, by the way, if you're really into Tolkien, you should read another book called The Silmarillion, and you'll see this clearer, more clearly in the Silmarillion. But you will learn then that Sauron in The Lord of the Rings is not the ultimate bad guy. Rather, he has a boss. He has a lord himself. And that bad guy is named Melkor. And Melkor, let me tell you a little bit about the Silmarillion, and we're running out of time, so I need to make this fast. But in the Silmarillion, Tolkien tells the story of how the creator of everything, his name is Iluvatar. He's like the ultimate god. Iluvatar created first the Ainur. And these Ainur were powerful beings, kind of like angels maybe, but they essentially sang the world into existence. And the greatest of these Ainur is Melkor. And Melkor wanted glory for himself, and he ended up being the world's great enemy. And so Sauron, the bad guy, the villain in The Lord of the Rings, is actually only the servant of Melkor. But with both Melkor and Sauron, neither one can create. They can only corrupt. They can't make things themselves. And so, for instance, the orcs, the goblins in The Lord of the Rings, they formerly were elves that Melkor had tortured and corrupted. And that leads us to say that in terms of worldview, the worldview of Lord of the Rings is not dualistic. A dualistic worldview is when you have is a worldview that says there are two equal powers, good and evil, and they're locked in a battle for all eternity. That's not the worldview of Lord of the Rings. Rather, good is supreme, and evil is just a derivation or a corruption of the good. Here's a second observation, and a bit more briefly, and that is that the world of the Lord of the Rings is both beautiful and it's broken. Viewers of the films and readers of the book get a sense as they enter this world of the past beauty and glory of Middle-earth, of which only fragments remain. And we see repeatedly, both in the films and the books, that the main characters on their journeys, they pass by ruined places and ruined palaces, and they pass by the ruined remnants of a previously glorious and beautiful civilization. If you've seen the films, you might remember when they're in the boats and they pass between the Argonauts, these massive statues of past kings. And they hear tales about heroic deeds of the past. And much of that world is gone. There's a sense of twilight that pervades the work, a sense that a civilization has been lost. There's a great sadness to The Lord of the Rings. But nevertheless, there is still great beauty, and great beauty that is the source of joy and hope. A third observation about the worldview of The Lord of the Rings is that power that is used in the service of one's own ends is both seductive, and by seductive meaning it's attractive, but in a dangerous way, and it is destructive. But there is a power for good beyond all evil. So how power is treated, I think, in The Lord of the Rings is interesting. On the one hand, power is dangerous when it's used for yourself, but at the same time, there is a power that ultimately will destroy all forms of evil. When I say that power is seductive, you might remember that that many of the main characters in The Lord of the Rings, whether it's Aragorn or Gandalf or Galadriel, they all have a chance to take the ring for themselves, and they choose to resist that temptation because they know it would destroy them and it would corrupt them. The only character who attempts to take the ring is Boromir, and he ends up being destroyed himself shortly thereafter. But power is dangerous. That's one of the themes, I think, of Lord of the Rings. At the same time, there is beauty and there is power that lies beyond all evil. I'm just going to read one quote. I'm not going to read anything else here in this talk from the Lord of the Rings, but I will read one brief quote. And this is a passage that takes place when Frodo and Sam are in the land of Mordor. This is in the last book, and they've undergone tremendous suffering and difficulty, and all seems hopeless. It seems like their quest to destroy the One Ring is not going to work, and all is darkness. And then we read this. This is about Sam, who, by the way, I think Sam is the hero of Lord of the Rings, but that's a separate topic. The land seemed full of creaking and cracking and sly noises, but there was no sound of voice or of foot. Far above the Eiffel d'Huez in the west, the night sky was still dim and pale. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark castle high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. His song in the tower had been defiance rather than hope, for then he was thinking of himself. Now, for a moment, his own fate and even his master's ceased to trouble him. I love that quote. That's one of my favorite quotes from that book, because Sam has this reminder that even if the shadow wins, its victory is only temporary. Fourth observation, and that is that the characters in Lord of the Rings are part of a story much bigger than themselves, and yet their deeds matter. There are acts of kindness in the worldview of the Lord of the Rings that are not wasted, and especially centering around the character of Gollum, because both Bilbo, and if you're familiar with the story, you know this, both Bilbo and Frodo have a chance to kill Gollum, and they don't. They refrain from doing so, and that act of mercy will change the fate of the entire world. But they're part of a much, much bigger story, and yet they themselves are not insignificant. Their deeds matter. Often their deeds involve great suffering, and often they find that in their journey, their acts of goodness require such suffering. And you can think about how each of the characters, whether it's Gandalf or Aragorn or Frodo himself, how they undergo suffering. Finally, the last observation that I'll make is that in the worldview of the Lord of the Rings, this life is not all that there is. And this world is not all that will be. I was going to play a clip, but I'm not going to in the interest of time. You can find it on YouTube, and you can just search for this quote where Gandalf says to Pippin, "The journey doesn't end here." And this is the passage in the film. You might be familiar with this, when Gandalf says that death is just the beginning of a new journey, and one that ends when you see white shores and a swiftly moving sunrise. It's a wonderful part of the film. But there's a clear picture in these films, that this life that can be accessed through the senses of the characters, that there is more to existence than just that world. Now, question 4, how do I fit into this world? That is, how do you think of that worldview? Well, you have to answer that question for yourself. But the last thing that I would say, and I'll end my talk here with this point, is that the worldview of Lord of the Rings, I would suggest, corresponds in a deep way to the Christian worldview. And I don't mean that it's an exact parallel, and it definitely is not an allegory. Tolkien himself didn't like the word allegory to describe his own creation, but that in some very clear ways, the worldview of Lord of the Rings connects with the Christian worldview. And that makes sense, because Tolkien himself was a committed Christian. Specifically, he was Roman Catholic. And one way to think of the Christian worldview is that the Christian worldview is a narrative or a story with 4 acts. And as we conclude, you can think about how these 4 acts, these 4 parts of the story, correspond to different aspects of the worldview of Lord of the Rings. That in the Christian worldview, the Christian story, God created the world in perfection, in beauty, in great beauty, and for his own glory. And then as the story continues, sin, that is human rebellion, entered the world, and it wrecked the world, although it did not completely destroy it. And so the world, according to the Christian worldview, the world that we live in is both beautiful and damaged. And you can see both how you experience that in your own life, and you can see how there's a parallel with the Lord of the Rings. But God chose not to end his creation. He chose not to destroy it, but rather he chose to rescue it. And in the Christian worldview, God did so by entering his own creation in the person of Jesus Christ. who suffered on the cross and who died and then rose in victory over death. And so we as human beings have hope. And again, there are some parallels in the Lord of the Rings with the hope of a future restoration, because the last part of the Christian worldview in this narrative form is that God promises to restore all creation to his intended purpose. Now, as a Christian, I believe that narrative, that worldview is true. It's not the place here to talk about exactly why I believe it's true. But my thesis, and this is a rather provocative suggestion, I think, but one of my theses as I read The Lord of the Rings is that I think that one of the reasons for the popularity for the last 70 years, one of the reasons for the popularity of Lord of the Rings is that it identifies longings of the human heart that are best answered with Christian truth. And the reason I say that's provocative is that I realize that you might be listening to this saying, well, he's some crazy Christian guy. Of course, he's going to say that. And he's going to find Christian parallels. That may be true, but we can talk later, I suppose. But I think that as human beings, we have a longing for wholeness. And we know this world is broken, but we long for beauty. We long to see the world restored to something that we know it is lost. We long to know that our lives have purpose, and the characters in the Lord of the Rings have their lives have purpose in that worldview, and we long too to know that our lives have purpose. We long to know that there is more to our existence than just a few short years of this life. And again, I would suggest that part of the appeal of the Lord of the Rings is that the characters in the Lord of the Rings come to understand that there is a vast universe beyond just their the few years that they spend in Middle Earth. I think it responds to some of the longings that we have as human beings. All right, that is all that I'm going to say, which is quite long enough and maybe not at all what you expected. But thank you for your attention. If you are still there, and if you long ago, if there are those who long ago checked out, well, I would understand. So thanks, Albina.
Thanks, Joe. Well, it was wonderful. And I think great conclusion that you said that our longings are kind of reflected in the Lord of the Rings and what we seek for. I wonder if we have time for one question. There are a few in the chat box, but I'm just going to copy here and Zoom one of them. It's from Rokas, and he asks, if a person has a nihilistic point of view to everything, is it still possible for him to be happy to just stay alive or be motivated to work for his future? So
that's a great question. Albina, you cut off there just for a minute, but I see the question that you've posted in the chat. Wow. Let's see. Should I answer this? Should I try to answer this in 5 seconds or in 5 hours?
I think shorter version would be better.
Not 5 hours. Actually, probably 30 seconds would be too long. We're probably out of time. But okay, that's a great question. And by nihilism, we would have to talk, I think, about what you mean by nihilism. If by nihilism you mean a sort of atheistic point of view that says there is no meaning beyond that which you create for yourself, if that's what you mean, is it possible for that kind of person to be happy? I would say this, I think it's possible for that person to experience pleasure. I'm not sure if it's possible for that person to experience happiness in the fullness that God would like for us to experience. And I know I'm speaking here just as partly out of my own Christian experience. But the Bible, which is a book that I view, a collection of books that I view as giving us information about God. One of the books of the Bible says that we can rejoice in all circumstances, even when we experience difficulty. And I think that kind of joy is only possible if we have something other than a nihilistic worldview, in particular, if we have a relationship with God through Jesus. That's longer than 5 seconds. I think that kind of person can experience pleasure, but I think that sort of pleasure might be rather temporary and rather fleeting.
All right. Well, Thank you for the answer. I was cut off a little bit, so I kind of missed the important part, but I believe it was good. Joe, thank you so much. I surely enjoyed listening to you. It felt like a very nice flashback to theology class and to the film and theology class that I never took, but it was it was very nice. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be with you all. Best wishes.